Eric, can you
Yes.
hear me? Make sure I'm co-host again. I had to reinstall
I
WebEx.
will do that. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I'm back on my computer.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Eric Ross.
Eric Ross.
Oh, got a bit of feedback going on here. So I am with EHI Consultants, part of the folks that work with the Department of Energy in Pike County, Ohio, at the DOE Portsmouth site, working in public affairs and dealing specifically with the local community. And it is my honor and privilege to be with you tonight. Our second night of our third round. It's our second night of our third round of DOE public meetings, in particular discussing the monitoring data and how we ensure that the work done on site is safe for workers, it is safe for the local community, and it is being done effectively and efficiently, and we're going to talk about all that tonight. We're really excited to have you with us. Had two big crowds at our last couple of sessions. Tuesday was a little small, but it looks like we've got some familiar faces sneaking in tonight, so we're looking forward to a nice and lively discussion. Hey, before we get rolling too far, let's talk a little bit about tonight's agenda. All right, tonight's agenda basically going to have like 4 pieces that we're going to look at. We're going to hear a Portsmouth site update. And that update tonight is going to be given by a new face. He's a guy you're going to become very familiar with, Jeremy Davis. He is the acting site lead for DOE at the Portsmouth site. And Jeremy is replacing Jeff Bettinger. Now, many of you have known Jeff for quite some time. He's been in Portsmouth for about 5 years, or had been in Portsmouth. And he, in December, retired and is now spending time with his family and doing great things and going to concerts and listening to music and enjoying the New England area with his wife. And so we wish Jeff all the best, and we're glad to have Jeremy with us tonight, and we'll introduce him to you shortly. After Jeremy and we hear the Portsmouth site update, we're going to hear from Colocated Air Monitoring Data. Frank Johnston has been with us several times in the past. You know, Frank is the Director of Environmental Remediation with Floor B&W Portsmouth, which is the main cleanup contractor that the Department of Energy utilizes for work at the Portsmouth site. And so you guys know Frank, and he's a great communicator, and he's going to be fantastic updating us on co-located air monitoring data that's taking place during the active demolition of the X326 building. And then after that, we're going to have Dr. Kathy Higley. Dr. Higley's been with us, several times for different meetings. And she's going to help put this all in context, right? So we hear lots of information, lots of data, but making sure what we're hearing and knowing how to place this in a box that we're familiar with. And that's what Dr. Higley's going to do. She's an expert at this, and she does this for folks all around the world, and she is independent of the Department of Energy, and she's really brought on as an expert here to help talk to us about this. And so we're thankful, as always, to have Kathy with us. Once we get through those portions of the night, we're going to have a public comment / questions portion of the night. We'll take a small break between presentations, let our presenters catch their breath, get a sip of water, and then we'll go into public comments and questions. Next slide, please, Donnie. All right, so throughout the night, we want to make sure that we're hearing from you, that this only works if it's a dialogue and there's active communication back and forth. And there are multiple ways, even though we're virtual, that you guys can interact with us. Maybe it's easier to interact this way than it is when we're in person, because we have so many opportunities and so many avenues to interact. First and foremost, ports-demo-questions@pppo.gov. Right? That email address is always open. We receive questions practically weekly from the first time we did the public meetings several months ago, 6 months ago. And so if you have questions, if something pops up, you can see it's in the chat box. Check it out, ports-demo-questions@pppo.gov. And then we'll handle those questions and get you typically a written answer back posted on the portsvirtualevent.com website. There'll be a small green box on about midway down the page on the left-hand side, and underneath it'll have Q&As. You can click on that and you can see what questions have been asked previously and see written answers to those. All right, while we're participating tonight, if you want to chime in and be active with us, there are 2 easy avenues. and that's through the chat features of both YouTube and WebEx. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can look on your lower right-hand corner. If you're on WebEx, you'll just need to look for the little chat button, and it's usually a little like air quote or an air bubble symbol, and you can click on it, and it'll give you a spot to type in. And you can type in your questions, and we'll collect those, and we'll discuss those tonight at the during the public question and comment session. So just to make sure we all know what we're talking about and where we're looking, if you would take just a second, pull up the chat box. You can see Charles loves using it right now. Let us know who you are and where you're from. Right? We've had folks from all over the country participate in these meetings at various times, and so we'd like to see who you are and where you're from. So if you'll throw your name and where you call home in the chat box, we'll just do a quick trial run to make sure that's working for everybody. All right. Okay, Donnie, next slide, please. Hey, one thing before we move on. We did receive a question at the very end of our meeting on Tuesday night. Bobby Vaughn sent us a question, and Bobby, I think you were on YouTube, so I don't see your name listed, but if you're there tonight listening, we did capture your question, and we will address it. I think it's going to be addressed in writing on the website. So we appreciate you chiming in with us on Tuesday night. All right, we'll talk about these, how to comment during the public comment period towards the end of the night, so keep it fresh on your mind. We will use the raise hand feature on WebEx. If you're on YouTube, unfortunately, you can't participate in the open comment. The technology doesn't work that way. But if you do see the little spot on the WebEx, it's a little hand. You can click on it. Possibly you might have a smiling face icon. If you click on that, it'll open up your emoticons box, which looks like the image on our screen. And you can just click the raise hand, and your hand will pop up, and we'll know during public comment period to call on you. So with that, before we roll into our presentations, we did have one more special guest tonight. Many of you know Joe Bradburn. Sorry, Joe. Joe Bradburn. He was site lead at Portsmouth for what seems like a great deal of time, and then has since moved on. And he is in. I'm trying to move you to the stage there, Joe. It's not letting me. He has since moved on to Lexington, where he is manager of the Portsmouth Paducah Project Office. So before we slide any further, we wanted to give Joel a chance to address our group. So Joel, the floor is yours, sir.
Eric, thank you very much. Probably the first is just a shout out to you. So thank you, Eric, for all you've been doing. You know, as an outstanding host, and you've really been a great facilitator of all of our public outreach and communication efforts. And so just thank you very much for your efforts and your excitement. The next is I'd just like to take the opportunity to welcome everybody to this presentation. I hope you will find it very informative. And then, I'll just quickly flip it over to Jeremy Davis. As Eric mentioned, Jeremy is the acting Portsmouth site lead, and I look forward to a lot of good leadership from Jeremy. And so thanks again, Jeremy, it's all yours.
Thanks, Joel. As Joel said, my name is Jeremy Davis. I'm the acting Portsmouth site lead. I've been on site here working in different capacities in the nuclear industry for over 20 years. I am a lifelong resident of Pike County. My educational background, I have a degree in natural science with concentration areas in biology, chemistry, and geology. Like I said before, I've worn a lot of different hats here, but project management, environmental compliance, hazardous waste management, environmental program integration, and facility oversight. I am currently a certified hazardous materials manager and a certified project management professional. So next slide. So if you're not familiar with our site, we are located in South Central Ohio. The plant proper takes up about 1,200 acres. That's pretty much inside Perimeter Road. The whole federal site is around 3,700 acres. It was dedicated to performing uranium enrichment operations, which started around 1954. And then the cleanup mission began in 1989. I came in 2002, and I was part of that original, some of that initial cleanup mission that began in 1989. However, full-scale demolition, decontamination, and cleanup began in 2010. And you'll see this background that we have here is one of the reasons we're here tonight having this discussion, and that is the demolition of the 326 facility. So the 326 facility was one of the large process buildings that is currently undergoing structural demolition. And we want to share with you guys some of the air monitoring results that we've taken during this demolition process. Next slide. So what is the department's focus over the next 10 years? That's a question we would like to answer for you guys tonight. And that is, we will complete deactivation and demolition and cleanup of the X326, the X333, and the X330, which are the three main process buildings that housed all the gaseous diffusion equipment here on site. We will also complete Cap 1 liners and 3 Cat 2 liners at the on-site waste disposal facility. This will give us a total of 6 cells to put demolition debris from the process facilities. We will also excavate landfills and plumes within the perimeter road. This excavation is done simultaneously with the placement of demolition debris. We do that so we can use that soil to get the compaction requirements that we need for our robust on-site waste disposal facility. And then, as most of you know, that landfill cleanup will provide contiguous land mass for future economic development. We also will transfer approximately 300 acres of land to the Southern Ohio Diversification Initiative. I'm happy to report that we've already transferred 80 acres over to SODI, and we hope to transfer the remaining 220 acres here in the not so distant future. Next slide. So when it comes to the 326 building deactivation, demolition, and cleanup, what have we completed so far? So in September of 2020, we declared that deactivation was complete. Deactivation included the removal of a lot of the process gas equipment, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and that was completed in September 2020. We then submitted the demolition design plan, which was basically a plan which described the process by which we would do structural demolition of the facility. That was submitted to Ohio EPA and approved February 2021. Transite removal, which, if you're not familiar with transite is an asbestos-containing siding material that was on the exterior of the facility. We initiated the removal of that transite in February 2021, and then we initiated full-scale demolition in May 17th, 2021. I'm happy to report that we did finally complete all the transite removal on November 23rd, 2021. And we reached one of our mission targets on January 24 of 2022 and achieved 50% demolition complete on that date. Currently, we are sitting around 60% complete with that structural demolition, and structural demolition will be completed by the end of this calendar year. So, next slide. So I really like this chart. It's I call it the real-time progress chart, and it gives you kind of where we've been during the stages of the series of public meetings that we've been having. So at the public meetings that took place in October, we were sitting around 20% complete, and the public meetings that were done on November 30th, we were sitting around 35% complete. And then today, we're sitting at that around 60% complete with the structural demolition. I would like to call your attention to the quadrants within these blue lines. The one to the far left, you'll see where we are starting to get the pad clear of the demolition debris that is being placed at the OSWDF. And then you'll notice as we progress to the right, you'll see some more demolition debris covered with some kind of a green tint. That is the demolition piles that have been size reduced, and they also have fixative sprayed on them to control the fugitive dust emissions from that demolition. In the quadrant in the center of the screen, you'll see some track shears actually performing some of that structural demolition. You'll see in the top of the photograph, you'll see some water misters that are being used to spray during active demolition. And that's another mitigation technique for keeping down those fugitive dust during that structural demolition process. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier about needing soil for placement of debris. So that has led us to the contaminated plume excavation. One of the first plumes I'd like to talk about was the one that we just had excavation complete, and that's the X740 plume. That X740 plume is represented by one of the purple blobs you see there inside the orange line. And that contamination plume was a trichloroethylene contamination plume. If you're not familiar with trichloroethylene, it was a pretty broadly used solvent during the Cold War era. But we were able to complete that excavation and deliver 40,000 cubic yards of soil and fill to the OSWDF to facilitate the placement of the 326 demolition debris. So currently in progress, we are excavating the 231B plume excavation, which is a bioremediation plot, and we will have excavation we anticipate completing excavation this summer of 2022. So what does this show you as the public? Well, this demonstrates that DOE is meeting its commitment to excavate plumes within the perimeter road, and that by doing so, by excavating these plumes, this will support the future reuse of the site. Next slide. So this picture you see here is of the on-site waste disposal facility. This kind of shows you some of the progress that's being made. There on the bottom right-hand side of the photographs, you'll see cell 1. That construction is complete and now accepting waste. You'll see kind of underneath that blue line where some of that debris from the 326 is being placed and then compacted in there with some of the soils from the soil excavations. The transfer ramp is located on the bottom right-hand corner of that orange square. That's where the waste actually comes in and is transferred from the trucks into the cell for placement. And then you'll see cells 4 and 5, which are currently under construction. I'm also happy to report that construction includes another transfer ramp into cells 4 and 5, which will be in place for the upcoming season, summer season for waste placement. In the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, this kind of gives you an idea of the robust design and engineering of our on-site waste disposal facility. The left-hand side is the liner system. This liner is a double protection liner. It's designed to contain and control hazardous waste material. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see the capping system. That capping system is designed and engineered for the same purpose. And we're very proud of that design and are happy to report that construction is going well. Next slide. So this is another really important slide to the department. So demolition safety requires deliberate and intentional planning when it comes to structural demolition of these facilities. So we developed a very safe and methodical demolition plan, which was approved by the state of Ohio EPA. We have the benefit of not being the first gaseous diffusion facility to undergo demolition. So we took lessons learned from other decommissioning experience across the DOE complex, such as ORNL, Hanford, and any time that we could glean from things that they identified during their demolition, we tried to apply those lessons learned to our planning mechanism. So our first step was to go in and remove, as I said before, that deactivation waste. So we tried to remove hazards from the building to make it safe for demolition. Excuse me. We removed the process gas equipment, some of the supporting components to help make the facility safer during that demolition. We also are happy to report that we have some of the most well-trained and experienced and capable workforce doing this demolition. You'll see some of them at work on the right where they're removing some of those transite panels and then performing different tasks associated with that demolition. So we have also integrated a lot of protective measures to minimize disturbance of any residual, radiological, or chemical contamination during demolition. You'll notice that blue tint that we keep talking about. That is a fixative. That fixative was applied to the facility on the outside and on the inside of the facility prior to demolition as one of the mitigation tactics to control any of that contamination that could become mobile during demolition. Next slide. This is probably a map that you've seen before, and it's probably one you'll see again and again, especially when it comes to talking about the 326. So this is a map of our air monitoring network. So if you look at the legend on the top left-hand side of the map, you'll see that you have the Ports Air Monitoring System, it includes DOE and Ohio Department of Health co-located air monitoring, along with DOE and Ohio EPA co-located air monitoring, and then DOE specific locations for air modeling or air monitoring, excuse me. You also see the bottom. These are project specific monitoring, air monitoring. They are represented by stars on the map. So we were able to take input not only from the community, but also DOE lessons learned, and then industry best practices to develop this network of air monitoring. We took into consideration meteorological data, and we really have developed a robust kind of a network and layering of monitoring equipment that is not only robust, but is also monitoring project specific goals to ensure that we are meeting our goals in safety. Air monitoring is just one of the many safety measures that's taken into consideration while performing this demolition. And we're happy to share with you some of those results tonight that demonstrate that the mitigation tactics that we have been able to implement are being effective. Next slide. So one of those things that DOE has also implemented is the real-time air monitoring. This approach helps give us real-time feedback while performing the demolition activities. So it's kind of our first line of defense. So these real-time air monitors have thresholds that have been established, and we look at the emissions from that project boundary so that we can make adjustments during demolition to ensure that we will not only be safe and compliant for the worker, but also protective of the environment and the public around us. This mechanism provides us the ability to immediately react to any kind of trend of elevation or anything like that we can actively adjust our mitigation controls on site. So weather conditions are a part of that. Weather conditions are also monitored real time. Wind speed, wind direction, all these things are taken into consideration during demolition so that we can ensure that we have the safest plan and approach in place. Next slide. So what does this data tell us so far? So Mr. Frank Johnston is going to be talking about some of that data here in just a moment. But I want you to keep in mind a few things as we go through that data. We're looking at things like particulate matter. That data recorded to date indicates that we have implemented effective and good controls for fugitive dust. So Fugitive dust are things like you would naturally or normally expect from a structural demolition of a facility, and that monitoring that particulate matter, you'll see from looking at the data, demonstrates that we have been able to control that fugitive dust. It also tells us that our contamination controls, including the applications of water and then the fixative, are also effective. We also will demonstrate that there are radiological releases, or there are, excuse me, will also demonstrate that we have been able to measure real-time alpha and beta measurements, which indicate that the controls instituted are protective of the workers and the public when it comes to radiological releases. That was a mouthful. Next slide. So here's a couple examples of those co-located air monitors. DOE, as I said before, worked with Ohio EPA and the Ohio Department of Health to co-locate a total of 23 air monitoring stations. In addition to DOE's data, Ohio EPA and the Ohio Department of Health air monitors will be able to provide that independent confirmation of air quality data during demolition work that I think everybody in the public is happy that is being done. So tonight's session will present the most recent results from the DOE monitors that are co-located with Ohio EPA and the Ohio Department of Health. Next slide. Here we have a beautiful sunset picture over the site, which signifies the end of my part of the presentation. And I'm happy to turn the rest of the presentation over to Frank Johnston, who is the Director of Environmental Protection for Fluor B&W of Portsmouth, and he will be going over some of that data with you folks. Thank you very much.
I am sorry about that. Assuming you can hear me now. Technology issues on my end, so I apologize. Thanks, Jeremy, and good evening, everybody. It is good to be with you virtually again. My name is Frank Johnston. I'm the Director of Environmental Protection here at Fluor BWXT in Portsmouth. I have about 38 years of experience in the environmental management and compliance fields, a lot of it on sites just like this that is engaged in remediation, environmental remediation and demolition activities. I have a good amount of experience in the air emission control systems and water treatment systems, the design, installation, and startup and operation of those types of systems. Next slide, please. So as Jeremy mentioned, you will see this chart, this map of the air monitoring stations several more times tonight, I should say. It is a little difficult to read, but the important part is here from this takeaway from this map is just the layering effect that we have put in place for all these air monitoring stations. We have a number of air monitoring stations represented by the stars around all of the active remediation projects, the excavation projects, the OSWDF operations, as well as the 326 demolition project. And then beyond those individual projects, that's where we have the co-located air monitoring stations, the 5 locations that are co-located with Ohio EPA, and the 18 that are co-located with the Ohio Department of Health. To the left of this chart is something that's called a windrose, and that is a chart that accumulates all the data that's collected, in this case over a year, to determine what the prevailing winds and the intensity of those winds are. We have a meteorological system that collects air direction and speed at a number of different heights, and it's collected at 15-minute intervals. And this is a conglomeration of that data over a year. So we use that windrows to help us locate the air monitoring stations that you see in the figure to the right. Next slide, please. So before I get into the co-located data that we've got, I do want to bring everybody up to date on the real-time data that we've been collecting at the 326 project boundary, the demolition project boundary. This is a chart of the particulate matter at the 10 micron level. Before I explain the data at the bottom, I would like to identify what those horizontal lines are. The one at the very top is represents the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for particulate matter at the 10 micron size, and that is at 150 micrograms per cubic meter. We apply that standard at the property boundary so that everything we do is trying to ensure that we are in compliance at the property boundary. The next two horizontal lines are action level lines. They're basically just a percentage of that top line, but those are lines that if we would happen to have an exceedance or a sustained exceedances above those lines, that we would take action to evaluate our operations, apply additional controls, those types of things. One of the things that we do have in place is that these particulate air monitors can send out real-time emails to me, to the project, to others. And as Jeremy indicated, that's what allows us to, in real time, apply and look at the situation and apply additional controls if needed. So then the bottom of that chart is the actual data. These are 24-hour averages between April 1st of 21 through the end of December 21. And you'll see that all the particulate matter data that we have been measuring has been well below, certainly well below the National Ambient Air Quality Standard that we use, but also below those action level lines that we have established. There's a couple call outs on that chart. One just shows the beginning of a structural demolition of the facility on May 17th. The other one shows calls out a little spike, probably the highest spike we've seen, and that had to do with actually the western wildfires that were occurring around that time. Kind of gives you an indication of how sensitive these monitors really are. Next slide, please. So at the co-located monitoring stations with Ohio EPA, we also have real-time particulate matter measurements. Again, at the top of the horizontal line there at the top is the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And then the data below is the measurements that have been taken at these co-located stations. The date range, I believe here, is from January of 2021 through the end of December. Again, these data show very good performance in fugitive dust. I will say that because these are removed from the project boundary of the demolition facility, these also measure perhaps other activities that are ongoing across the site. So, and we pay attention to fugitive dust at all of our locations, all of our projects, to make sure that we keep the particulate matter where it needs to be. Next slide, please. So the other real-time measurements that we make that Jeremy has alluded to is real-time alpha and beta measurements. These are real-time alpha measurements in this chart. This is at the demolition project boundary. You'll see the very top line is a daily limit, 0.8 DAC hours. That's a health-based limit for workers, but that's what we are measuring towards to ensure their safety. But that also provides, you know, a level of safety for, you know, off-site receptors as well. So you'll see at the very bottom the actual the lines, the measurements that were taken, all very, very low compared to that standard. If that standard happens to be exceeded, those stations are monitored continuously. They have their own alarms, so if there would be an exceedance, that we would be immediately being able to take action. We've added a couple call outs in this just for interest's sake. The very left is when we began the demolition and loadout operations. We saw a little bit more variability in the readings during the hot weather months because of increased air movement. You'll see after that we did deploy some additional dust destroyers. I got a picture of that later on in the presentation where we were able to apply some additional dust control measures. And then I just wanted to point out a normal seasonal loadout pause. We're in a pause situation now. That's a normal situation. And loadout refers to the loading of the debris that you'll see, those piles that's on the 326 pad, that's loaded out into trucks and transferred up to the OSWDF. But we have a seasonal pause during cold weather months for those loadout activities and placement in the OSWDF. And then at the very far right there, you'll see that's the loadout resumption. We are planning on resuming loadout activities at the OSWDF probably in the mid to late March timeframe. Next slide, please. So I mentioned one of the dust destroyers. There is a picture of that at the top right-hand corner of this slide. It's a track-mounted device that can apply with basically a water cannon that can apply water and fixatives to the debris piles that have been generated. At the bottom picture shows these debris piles. You'll see some color. There's some green and some blue color. That's the fixatives that have been applied to the piles. We routinely apply that fixative as one of the controls that we implement to make sure that we're in control of fugitive dust. So all this real-time data that I presented, and Jeremy alluded to it, it's indicating that we've got pretty good control of the fugitive dust. We're seeing we've been very successful in our application of the water misting and fixatives, and the real-time alpha and beta measurements that we're taking is indicating that we are being protective of the workers and the public from these activities. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk a little bit about the sampling data that we've collected from the DOE and Ohio EPA co-located stations, as well as the DOE and Ohio Department of Health co-located stations. But to set that up, I want to go through just a couple slides just to identify how we determined what we were going to be sampling for. As Jeremy indicated, we went through an extensive deactivation of the 326 building. It was about a 10-year effort. That's when we removed hazardous waste. We did asbestos abatement. We removed fluids, oils, those types of things to make the facility ready for open air demolition. But even with all those efforts, just because of the operational history of the facility, there was still some residual chemical contamination and some residual radiological contamination left in the building. But there was also contaminants that are associated with the building materials themselves. Some of the heavy metals, things like that are associated with concrete, structural steel, TCE, that trichloroethylene that Jeremy mentioned that was used as a solvent, and asbestos. Again, as asbestos abatement occurred, so all the friable asbestos was removed. We take great care in the transite removal to ensure that there is no asbestos that is released in mishandling those transite panels. Point being, there is some contaminants just associated with the building materials that we have to take into account. So from this residual contamination that we have, and knowing the materials of construction of the building, we were able to develop a contaminants of concern list that includes non-radiological contaminants such as heavy metals, asbestos, volatile organic chemicals that includes trichloroethylene and polychlorinated biphenyls. We also have a list of contaminants of concern under the radiological contaminants, including uranium and technetium, and a couple of the transuranics that I'll identify later on in this presentation. Next slide, please. So we have a list of contaminants of concern, and we want to understand how and to what degree those contaminants could become airborne and then impact off-site, off-property situations. So we did what is as an extensive air model that was developed during the design of the demolition project for the 326 facility. That model took into account the contaminants of concern, but it also included assumptions on emission estimates from a variety of the activities that included things like crushing of the concrete, the pulling down and size reducing of the structural steel, the location of piles and the load out of those piles. So there were emission estimates that were developed for all of those activities. And with the contaminants, the emission estimates, these were put into a model that provided us an indication of what the offsite impact would be. The model was telling us that with the proper controls that we could effectively control the air pollutants and be protective of human health and the environment, and comply with the Clean Air Act standards that we are obligated to comply with. That model not only addressed the 326 demolition, it's important to realize that that model took into account all the activities that were ongoing, the excavation activities, as well as the OSWDF operations. So it's a very comprehensive model that looked at the issue from a site-wide perspective. That model was provided to Ohio EPA, and they concurred with that model on May 20 in the year 2020. We also used that model as a key in helping us locate the monitoring stations that the subject of this conversation. Next slide, please. Here's that chart again. This is showing the Ohio EPA and Ohio Department of Health monitoring stations that are co-located with the DOE stations. The map is oriented towards the top being north. That's difficult to see. There will be other maps that call out specifically the Ohio EPA and ODH monitors. There are 18 locations for the Ohio Department of Health co-located stations and 5 for Ohio EPA. Next slide, please. These co-located monitoring stations, and Jeremy has already touched on it, is a great idea. It's a win-win for everybody. It really provides a confidence in that we have a redundancy in the air sampling results. It gives the regulators and public an independent mechanism to verify and validate the Department of Energy data, and it just adds a level of transparency that I believe is very important with our state regulatory agencies as well as our neighbors. That transparency is very important as we're going through these cleanup and demolition activities. Next slide, please. These are an example of the air monitoring stations that we'll be talking about. On the left are an example of the 5 Ohio EPA DOE co-located stations. These are the ones that are used for non-radiological sampling that includes particulate matter, volatile organic chemicals, heavy metals, and asbestos. Data is gathered from these quarterly, validated, and published quarterly. To the right are an example of the Ohio Department of Health and the DOE co-located stations. There are 18 locations on and off site. Are monitoring for radiological constituents at these locations. We do monitor for fluoride, but we monitor for fluoride only at the DOE stations. The data is gathered similar to the Ohio EPA stations. They're gathered, analyzed, and published on a quarterly basis. We'll make the point that the data that we're going to discuss tonight, is the DOE data that's collected from these co-located stations. Next slide, please. Here is the map yet again. This is showing the locations of the DOE and Ohio EPA co-located stations. Again, it's oriented north. I believe that is station A50 at the very north and A51 at the very south end of the property. These stations are used to sample for heavy metals. A few of them all of them are listed there, and that's sampled on a weekly basis. We also sample for volatile organic compounds on a weekly basis, as well as fibers and asbestos fibers at these locations on a weekly basis. Next slide, please. So before I present some of the data, I did want to identify what we are using as the standard that we're comparing our data to. And this is called the maximum acceptable ground level concentration. This is derived from Ohio EPA technical guidance. And we apply these MAGLIC standards at the property boundary. Those standards are calculated values. They're based on exposure and operational assumptions. They also implement per chemical, per element, threshold limit values that's published by OSHA and the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. As I said, they are calculated values. These are used for non-radiological parameters, and we apply these at the property boundary, and that's what we believe to be the protective limit. These were identified in that air model I mentioned that was concurred with by Ohio EPA. So we're using these as our protective standards applied at the property boundary. Next slide, please. So here is some data, and I'm not going to go through every number presented there, but I do want to call out, really the important takeaway here. But I wanted to explain a little bit the chart that we're looking at right now. So on the very left column there is the analytes. That includes the metals and trichloroethylene that we've listed there that we're sampling for. The next column over is the MAGLIC, maximum allowable ground level concentration in micrograms per cubic meter. Again, that is a calculated level by the element or the compound of concern, contaminant of concern, and it is listed there. That's the standard that is protective for those individual analytes that are there. And then we have the actual data, and this is the maximum detections that we have seen at these stations. The 5 columns across the top there are the A50 through A54 are the monitoring stations. The data below there is showing the maximum detection, the maximum detected amount for those analytes. So for instance, if you look at antimony, the calculated protective standard is 11.9 micrograms per cubic meter. The maximum that has been detected uh, at station A50 is 0.0127. So not going through each and every one of those numbers, but it's important to note that all of the data we've collected so far are far below those protective standards as identified by the MAGLIC values. Next slide, please. This is essentially the same data. The data is laid out in the same manner, but this is the average detections. Again, won't go through each and every one of these numbers, just to say that the average detections that have been noted are also, well below the protective standard as defined by the MAGLIC. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we do asbestos sampling at these locations weekly. We sample for all fibers, and then we also sample for asbestos fibers. We also do a good amount of asbestos monitoring under the industrial hygiene program at the project, within the project, and at the project boundary. But the asbestos samples and the fiber samples are sent off to an independent lab, analyzed by the NIOSH approved standards. And we have had no indication of any asbestos fibers at any of these 5 locations. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about the radiological sampling that has been conducted. Again, the map to the right shows these sampling stations, the Department of Energy and Ohio Department of Health co-located stations. You will see that most of them are on property, but there are several that are off property. And we sample at these stations for transuranics, and I'll discuss those on our next slide, but we sample those on a quarterly basis. We sample for thorium isotopes on a quarterly basis. And then we sample for total uranium and uranium isotopes on a monthly basis at these locations. And we also sample technetium-99 on a monthly basis at these locations. Next slide, please. So transuranics are essentially just elements that are heavier than uranium. So we provided the periodic table of the elements here to show you where the transuranics that we monitor for are neptunium, plutonium, and americium. Those transuranics have been actually sampled at DOE ambient air monitoring stations for quite some time, dating back to at least the mid-90s. And the results from that sampling has been reported in the annual site environmental reports since that time. There have been, on isolated instances, some detections of a transuranic isotope. But since we have begun demolition, given the data to date, 326, we have not detected any transuranics at any of these sampling locations. Next slide, please. And this is a chart that essentially says nothing. There's no detects of thorium isotopes or transuranics at any of these locations to date. Next slide, please. So I do want to talk about just a couple of contaminants. We'll talk about total uranium first. There are 2 charts presented here, but it's the same data. It's just presented at different scales, largely because the detections that we have experienced have been very, very low. The larger chart is a range of 0 to 6 micrograms per cubic meter. You'll see the horizontal line there that indicates what the Department of Energy derived concentration standard is. That's a standard that we do apply as well at the property boundary. But along the horizontal axis at the bottom are the air monitoring stations themselves, and it's ordered from what's closest to the 326 demolition activity to what's furthest away. So the A52 station is closest. The A37 station is the background station. I believe that's approximately, if my memory serves me correct, about 13 miles um, away from the Portsmouth facility. So the smaller inserted chart is really, it's the same data, but it's just presented at a very much lower scale. So we have had some detections of total uranium as indicated there. These are represent the maximum that has been detected at these locations. So again, it's very low, and the performance so far has been very very good. Next slide, please. This is a chart, a couple charts laid out in a similar manner for technetium-99. Again, it's the same data, but it's presented at two different scales. Again, along the horizontal axis is the indication of the air monitoring stations going from closest to furthest. The axis of ranges from 0 to 2,000 picocuries per cubic meter. 2,000 picocuries per cubic meter is the derived concentration standard for technetium-99. So the inserted graph, again, just shows some, it's at a much lower scale than the larger graph, just kind of indicating or providing a little bit more granularity of the results that we've seen. These range, the scale ranges from 0 up to 0.0014 picocuries per cubic meter. Obviously very much lower than the scale for the larger chart there. But we have had some detections for Tech-99. These are also presented as maximum detections. These are the maximums ones that we've experienced at these stations since January of 2021. Next slide, please. So just a couple summary statements here. The results from the co-located air monitors between Ohio EPA and Ohio Department of Health comparing to the DOE data have been very consistent. There is some variability in the data. If you go to the websites below and see the data posted at Pegasus, you'll see that the Ohio EPA and Ohio Department of Health data is posted with DOE data together. There is some variability in the data, but it's which is to be expected. But it's very consistent. So it would appear the one conclusion could be made is that the sampling has been very good and the analysis very consistent. The second takeaway, and it's the most important takeaway to date, is that the results from all these monitors, all the data that we've collected, are well below the regulatory limits that we've established, the protective limits that we've established, indicating that all our activities have been protective of our neighbors, protective of human health and the environment. I did mention there's some websites. DOE posts data as well as Ohio EPA and the Ohio Department of Health at that Pegasus website. Ohio EPA posts their data. It's listed there. The Ohio Department of Health also posts their data at that location. I believe that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I will now turn it over to Dr. Catherine Higley, who will talk about air monitoring and the risk associated with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. I hope you can all hear me. My name's Kathy Higley, and I am a professor at Oregon State University. I have a doctorate and a master's in radiological health sciences and a bachelor's degree in chemistry with a specialization in radiochemistry. I've been at Oregon State since 1994, and the research that I do looks at how radionuclides move through the environment to impact both people and non-human organisms, plants and animals. And myself, my students, we've done research in contaminated environments all around the globe. Next slide, please. So you've seen a lot of data tonight about samples, results, measurements, varying standards that are being discussed. And the takeaway from this is that there are different safety regulations based on, are we looking at protecting the workers? We're looking at protecting the public, or, and in some cases, protecting people doing recreation. And the recognition is that the risk varies in part, as your employment, you accept a certain level of risk in order to do your job. And at home, you expect things to be relatively safe. So there are regulations out there that may focus on the same entity, radionuclides, for example, but the standards for protection are different based on if you are working at the site or if you're at home. Next slide, please. So you've also seen discussion about the types of air monitoring systems that have been in place during this effort. And the big takeaway here is that there's both close-in and distant monitoring stations used at ports, and they do a couple different things. So one of the things to recognize is you are taking down these buildings. You have the potential to aerosolize or raise into the air some of the contaminants, and generally, you expect the highest level of airborne concentration to be closest in to where you're doing the work. And so this graphic here on the right-hand side shows what's sort of a classic bullseye pattern, where you could kind of think of it like a mountain almost. The highest concentrations are closest in to where you're doing the work. And so at the port site, you have multiple movable monitors that follow the work activity, and the focus of these is predominantly on worker health and safety. But you also are concerned about the potential for material to move off-site. And generally, because this material drops out of the air, the further you get away from the point of activity, the concentrations are lower. And so you need to have different kinds of sampling, perhaps prolonged sampling periods. So you can have fixed locations around the site that monitor for the same material, but they may take larger air samples, for example. Next slide, please. And as Frank had mentioned, placing the air monitors around the site to look for the potential releases of these contaminants of concern, it's not a random process, and it's actually pretty darn involved. And one of the first things that you have to do is understand the wind patterns around the site. And so through monitoring of air using meteorological towers, meteorological sampling, you can develop what's called a windrose, and it just tells you the frequency of the time the wind blows from a particular direction and how fast it's blowing. And these windroses can be developed for night, for day, for a year, for a decade, but it lets you know what the predominant wind directions are. And by also knowing what the wind speed is, it gives you an idea of how far material might actually travel once it's released into the air. And so you use this windrose information, you can plug it into a computer model, and it can predict what ground level concentrations are likely to be around the site based on these wind patterns. You can establish your sampling locations, and then you can actually confirm by taking measurements and looking at the results that you've got that you've placed things in the right spot. Next slide, please. The other thing that we've seen on the data that Frank has provided is information regarding the concentration of contaminants in the air. And the thing that's important to recognize is that the regulations vary, again, based on whether it's occupational or public exposure that we're concerned about. And the reason being is occupational exposure typically is for a limited period of time, 40-ish hours a week, and we assume that we have a pretty healthy workforce somewhere in the 18 to 70 year age range. But the public exposure, we assume, can happen continuously, 24 hours a day, and it can include the very young, the very old, people that are at risk for certain, health conditions and such. And so generally what you find is that the exposure limits are different for each group. For workers, they're a bit higher. For the public, those limits can be 10% to maybe even 0.2% of the values that are allowed for occupational exposure. And again, as Frank had mentioned in summarizing the data that you've seen over the last several slides, none of the data suggest any releases approaching the limits, whether it's for offsite or for the workers on site. Next slide, please. So as he also mentioned, there's something called contaminants of concern, and this is where you take a look at what kind of activities have taken place at the site, what sort of historical compounds have you worked with, and you can develop a list of chemicals, of radionuclides, and other materials that you think might be potentially released during your activities of deactivation or decommissioning these facilities. And so Frank showed you a periodic table of the elements. That it's a pretty wide swath of metals that are being sampled there. Most of the radionuclides are down in the actinium series, with the exception of technetium, and these are circled in red, which is it's also a fission product, long-lived radionuclide. And in addition, you have asbestos and volatile organic compounds. So you take a look at what the activities are on the site. You figure out what it is you want to be able to sample, or what you should be sampling. And then the next slide, please. You also have to think about, are there other sources of these compounds that you're concerned about? And just for example, metals, there are natural sources, but there's also other industry sources of metals that you might need to take into account when you're doing your sampling and trying to interpret the data that you see. The same thing for radionuclides. We know certain radionuclides such as uranium and thorium are naturally occurring. They're all over the environment. You can also see elevated concentrations of them naturally in things such as fertilizer, but we do know that they're also associated with nuclear activities. So you need to be aware of what the potential sources are when you interpret the data that you've collected. And then similarly for the other contaminants that are monitored, asbestos, volatile organics, you have to say, well, are there any other natural sources? Because asbestos is in fact a natural compound that we have mined and processed to make these the panels that have been utilized in the facilities. Next slide, please. So for example, looking at radionuclides, we have both radioactive compounds, radionuclides, that are present in the soils globally. And the top left-hand map actually shows an image developed by the U.S. Geologic Survey for North America that provides a measurement of the radiation dose rate about a meter off the ground from naturally occurring radionuclides in soils. And this includes things such as uranium and thorium and potassium. They all have radioactive versions of themselves. And what we know about this natural radioactivity is that the underlying geology and geochemistry kind of dictate where these concentrations are. So in the middle west part of the United States, an area where there's a lot of uranium mines, for example, you see this elevated pink color, and that's largely, not 100%, but largely attributed to the uranium and the thorium that are in the soils. Now, in addition to radionuclides, we have radiation that's coming to us from outer space, and we get it from the cosmos, we get it from solar activity, and your dose rate goes up the closer you are in higher you are in elevation. So if you're standing on a mountaintop, your dose rate um, could be considerably greater than if you're standing at a beach. And you can just simply look at this map of the United States and you see the coast of Florida, the projected dose rate's about 35 millirad a year. You're at sea level. You've got a very thick layer of atmosphere between you and the sun and you and the cosmos. But in places such as Colorado, you could be a mile, 2 miles high, and the atmosphere that's serving as a shield, there's a lot less of it. So you don't like to think about radiation shielding of the atmosphere, but it actually makes a substantial difference. So all taken together, we can get natural doses every year on average in the United States of about 300 millirem per year. And it comes from the radioactivity in the soils, it comes from radioactivity in outer space, and it also comes from radioactivity that's simply present in our body because we are made up of the atoms in our natural environment. And so on average around the United States, we receive a dose of about 300 millirem per year. Now it can vary. If you live in Leadville, Colorado, you get the double whammy of being nearly 2 miles above sea level, plus you also have a lot of uranium in the soils. But so again, these are average numbers. Well, in addition to that, people take advantage or utilize, I shouldn't say take advantage, they use the medical system. And so if you have things such as dental x-rays or mammograms or x-rays for bones or bone density measurements, all of these things can contribute to medical exposure. And again, on average around the United States, that's another 300 millirem per year. So the background from both natural and medical on average to people in the United States is around roughly 600 millirem per year. Now, if you look at the annual site environmental reports for the Portsmouth site, they calculate potential doses to the public from releases and activities at the site. And what you see is that those doses are roughly on the order of 1 millirem per year. So it's a tiny, tiny fraction of what we're already seeing from the natural background and from medical. So how do we interpret that? Well, I'm going to go to the next slide, which is it's a little more complicated and it's sort of animated. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at what do we know about radiation and radiation effects. And we're going to look at the periods over where the exposures occur. And we're going to look at a huge range of doses from about a millirem up to 10 million millirad. Now, it's a little strange. This is a part of our radiation protection profession, but when you get to really, really high doses, we change how we actually describe and calculate the dose rates. But most of the time we deal in millirem. And for comparison, if you look, the 600 millirem a year that we normally see in the United States, it's kind of down in this blue region. We're going to look at environmental doses, some medical information, and some other doses. So if I could have you advance the slide, please. So we know from studies on effects on animals and also on humans, in really high dose region, we see severe effects, including death. But in the low dose region, where we can measure the radiation field, statistically, we don't observe any bad adverse effects. So we have this high dose region. We can relate dose to effect. It's obvious, it's observed. But in this lower region, and it's not all that much lower, we can measure the radiation, but we calculate the effects using mathematical models. The natural environment fits in that region where we can measure the dose rates, but we don't see any adverse effects. Diagnostic medical procedures are down in the low region as well. Radiation therapy, where you're intentionally killing cells, is in the high dose region. All of this information and our understanding come about because we've observed and researched the Japanese bomb survivors from Chernobyl, to a much lesser extent, also from Fukushima, and then other studies from nuclear workers, medical applications, and such. But the big takeaway, in the natural environment, while we can measure radioactivity, we do not observe adverse effects. We could try and calculate them, we don't observe them. And when you get to looking at cleanup for DOE facilities, for example, the typical cleanup goals are way down in the 15, 10 millirem type of range, very low, where all we do is estimate risk using a model. Next slide, please. So the goal, as you've heard today, is to be deactivating, and I keep saying decommissioning, and that's not the right word anymore because I'm an old dog and you can't teach me the new tricks. But taking these facilities down and turning this site over for commercial redevelopment. And doing it requires that the site operators protect the workers, protect the public, and protect the environment. And it's not a simple process because they've had to look at the historical uses of the site. They have to analyze what the potential releases are. They have to plan their activities, and then they have to implement them. They have to figure out where their monitoring stations are going to be based on both safety of workers, public, and the relevance of the sites. And then, they start taking the facilities down. And as I said, ultimately the goal is to release this for redevelopment. Next slide, please. So when I started this talk, I was talking about sort of acceptable risk. And the point is, it does vary. The levels that workers versus the general public are exposed to are different. So the risk varies, but the goal of this remediation, is not to get rid of all risk, because that's not something that's possible considering we have naturally occurring radionuclides at the site, for example. But the intent is to reduce this down to a level that's acceptable for the workers, for the public, and environment. And safety is always part of this process. So I thank you for your time, and I turn it over to the ever wonderful Eric. Thank you, Eric. And you're muted.
And I'm muted. Hey, thanks, Kathy. I really appreciate it. Trying to do too much managing the stage and move people around. Hey, what we're going to do right now, I want to thank Kathy, I want to thank Frank, I want to thank for Jeremy for the presentations, Joel for the kind words at the beginning of his introduction, and welcome. But let's plan on right now pausing for just a moment. I have 6:16. What if we take a break, let everyone stretch their legs, get a sip of water? What if we come back at let's make it 5 minutes, right? Let's do 5 minutes. We'll take a short break. And then when we come back at 7:22 Eastern time, 7:22, we'll take a look at public comments. We'll answer questions or address the questions that have been presented tonight, and we'll move forward with the evening. So it's a short 5-minute break, and we will see you in just a moment. All right, guys, welcome back. Welcome back. So glad to have everyone here. We have just a few questions that we wanted to make sure we addressed, and then we will step aside. Hey, Donnie, can you throw up the presentation for me, please? All right. While we're waiting on that, let's take a brief second, and we're glad to have Dr. Higley, Frank, and Jeremy back with us on the stage at this point. And we're going to take just a second, and we're going to walk through some questions that were submitted either Tuesday night or in the last couple of days, and maybe a couple questions that have been submitted. And then again, let me remind you, if you would like to provide comment or ask questions orally, that there is an opportunity to raise your hand. I can see Ms. Vina already has her hand raised. We'll be right to you, Ms. Vina. Just if you can find the on the WebEx, there's either on my version on the if you have the app downloaded, you can see the hand, and you can download there. If not, you can click on the emoticon, and it'll open reactions, and it'll give you a chance to raise your hand. You can see the image right here. Donnie, can you go back one slide, and we'll cover the options. You can obviously submit anything in the chat on either WebEx or YouTube, but let me just share that email address one more time. ports-demo-questions@pppo.gov. I've said it 1,000 times. I repeat it to my kids just because it rolls off the tongue. ports-demo-questions@pppo.gov. And if you think of a question later on in the week, go ahead and shoot it to us, and we will that email is constantly checked, and we will get you that response to it. Okay. So if our panel is ready, we've got a handful of questions we wanted to take a look at. Make sure you guys are all unmuted. All right. So the first question is for you, Jeremy. You mentioned transuranics, and this is a question from Bobby Vaughn that we got at the end of our meeting Tuesday night. How did the transuranics first arrive at the Ports Gaseous Diffusion Plant, and how do we inform workers of any threats with transuranics?
Yeah, sure. I'll respond. So we'll post a more thorough response to this question online. But I can tell you that DOE and our contractors have a very robust training and qualification program. All the employees have to complete this program to work on site. Our training programs are designed to inform the workers of not only the physical hazards, but also the radiological hazards to ensure safety of our workers, the environment, and the public. So hope that answers the question.
Yeah, perfect. All right, second question on the night's from Lee Blackburn. Hey, Lee, thanks for being with us tonight. It's for Frank. During your presentation, you had a chart on TCE showed significant levels at A52 and A53. Let me pull that chart up so we can all see what we're looking at here. Oh, that's the Tech 90. Do we have the TCE chart, or is this what we were looking at here? Is this so, Frank?
Yeah, I am assuming the question involves technetium 99. I will say, Tech-99 is one of those contaminants of concern, so that we knew that some of that residual contamination was still present in 326. But as far as the charts go, we have to remember that the scales between the larger chart and the smaller inserted chart are the smaller one is much, much lower. It's about 1 million times less than the scale that's on the larger chart. So it is showing some detections, as you've noted, but they're very, very low. And those stations that you mentioned are the ones that are closest to the 326 demolition. So to somewhat some logical degree, you would expect that that's where you would have, if you were going to have some detections, you'd have them at those locations. But I think the real takeaway here is just the scale of what I'm presenting here. This is the same data it's just presented at a million times lower for that smaller chart there. I hope that helps.
That's perfect. Thanks, Frank. Couple other questions from Lee. Frank's chart on thorium and transuranics was only through June of 2021. Why is that? And I think we have that posted to the website. Charles, can you put a link to that portsvirtualevent.com? And then on that website, Lee, on the left-hand side, you can kind of scroll down. There's a green box, and you can click on Q&As. And that question's been asked in the past, and we have the full written answer that's clear and easy to track there. All right. Kathy, ma'am, got a question for you. During your presentation, you showed a chart on potential sources, but the site wasn't included. Once again, why is that?
So the point that I was making was, in addition to the process of identifying the contaminants of concern, and that's where the one table that showed metals, radionuclides, and other contaminants. So you identify those through your record search, through your understanding of the processes. So you know that they're being used there. But then when you want to interpret the data that you're collecting, you also need to be aware, are there any other potential sources? So we already know that those contaminants are present at the site. They were identified as contaminants of concern. But then you need to also consider, are there any other potential sources that might complicate the information that you're seeing? Perfect.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Two final questions from Lee, and they both are kind of, I get to address those. One, when will the next site-specific advisory board meeting be held? It's been 9 months since the last one. Has DOE decided not to have them anymore? It has been a while since we've had the last SSAB meeting, and we are eagerly looking forward to the next one. We currently have a membership package waiting to be signed off on from DOE headquarters, so we're in the final stages of that. Several new members, reappointments of current members, and as soon as we have that membership package in place, we will go through the necessary steps, especially in light of COVID, make sure we're accounting for protection and health and safety that way. And so we're looking in the next couple of months to be able to have our return to the SSAB, but we don't have an exact date just yet because we are being withheld on a membership package. As soon as that's ready, we'll let you know, Lee. And thanks for always checking on that. I appreciate it. And then for your other questions, or any questions asked, I believe I gave the wrong website. You can get to it through the portsvirtualevent.com website, but it's much easier to track those answers through portsdemo.com, right? So you give it probably middle of the month. The target date is the 18th, is to have answers to any of the questions that weren't addressed tonight in writing. And you can find answers to previous questions there as well. So portsdemo.com would be that location to check that out. All right. So Charles said we're working on that. Perfect. All right. So we're going to slide forward to our public comment portion of the night. If you would like to participate in public comment, if you would be so kind as to find the button on your screen that allows you to raise your hand, and just go ahead and raise your hand now. At that point, we can unlock your the mute feature on your phone or on your device. All right, I saw a hand and then it moved. Vina. All right, Vina, we're going to give you about 4 minutes, ma'am. You know how this works, and we're going to ask you to ask your questions or comment. And again, any comment provided or question provided at this time will provide an answer in writing to you as appropriate, and can kind of go from there. So let's. Oh, I lost you, Vina. There we are. All right, sent you a message to unmute. Are you there, ma'am?
Yes.
Hey, how have you been?
Very busy.
Good, good. All right, floor is yours, ma'am.
Okay, I want to thank Miss Catherine Higley for saying that high dose radiation kills workers. And so that must be the reason that we are getting compensated at Piketon, because there's so many workers that have died from that facility and that are sick, including myself. So I appreciate you saying that high dose radiation kills workers. And the other thing is press Portsmouth Piketon residents for environmental safety and security and National Nuclear Workers for Justice. We are requesting split samples that you give to the EPA from the fallouts of the plant into the creeks. Plus, we'd like to have a split sample of some of the soil samples that the EPA is reading and see what we can come up with. Our other request is that you please stop lying to the workers in the community about the contamination and how in the world you think you can give Ohio Valley Regional Development, or whatever they're called now, some of the contaminated land out there is unreal. I mean, you're just giving these people false hope. That whole plant is contaminated on site and off site, according to DOE's own records. I know you went and did a celebration, a 70-year celebration on the plant, and it wasn't even time for the celebration of the plant, but our Portsmouth commissioner sucked it right in and did a good publicity stunt for you guys. I'm appalled that, Catherine, we're not really interested in the cosmetic and the fallout from all over the world. We're interested in what's going on at Piketon. We want to know what's going on at Piketon, what's the exposures to the workers, what's the exposures to the community. You're giving us atomic fallout is not helping us none whatsoever. And I'm appalled that they would pay someone to come into our community and tell us that. It's appalling. I don't know how much you get paid, but I say you get good money to come in here and lie to this community. And most of you, these other workers, like what's his name that just retired? He didn't spend his money here. He spent his money out of town. He wasn't even from here. You guys that come in here from out of
Hey,
town, you do
Vina,
not.
this is Eric.
Well, I got to say
Vina,
this. Right. You guys that come in here from out of town have no intentions, good intentions for this community and for these.
hey, Vina, this is Eric. I've paused you for a second, put you on mute. Catch your breath. We would love to hear your questions and your comments, but I can't let you get on here and personally attack anybody else. Okay. So I'm going to unmute you again, but I'm going to ask that you kind of keep us above board. Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Are you there, Vina? I sent you a message to unmute. We'll give her just a second. Oh, are you there, Vina?
Yes.
All right. Let's try again.
It's okay for you guys to come in and downplay all the problems at the plant site, but we're the ones who live here in this community, and we're the ones who work at that plant, and we're the ones who are sick, and the cancer is outrageous in Piketon. And for you to bring people here and tell us that there's light fallout, but we don't have off-site contamination when your own documents have proved it. It's been in the media for years. It's an injustice to this community that you allow people to come in here and lie more. And we can't wait for you guys to have a public meeting again.
Hopefully thank you for your comments, by the way, Vina. I appreciate that. And as always, it is good to hear from you. You've been a active and vocal participant in this process for a long time. And hopefully with COVID numbers settling and things moving forward, we can move back to a chance to be in person soon. All right, looking for anyone else that would like to provide comment at this point. If you just raise your hand on the WebEx, we will identify you at that point. Oh, Vina, we've already called on you. We'll have to catch you next time. If you have written comment, you can send it to the ports-demo-questions@pppo.gov. And we can catch you there. Are there any other comments at this point? All right, seeing none, let's call it a night, folks. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your patience and your willingness. And every time we do this on the virtual medium, it's not quite the same as being in person, but we get a little better at it, a little smoother, and interaction seems to be a little easier. I, again, want to thank Joel. I want to thank Jeremy, Frank, Kathy for coming and sharing their time, their thoughts, their comments with us. And as always, if you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to send it to the email. Thanks to Jack and his team, Julie over on the side that's doing the YouTube, and everyone that's pulled this off. It takes a small army to make this work and to be seamless, and we appreciate all of that.